Our next speaker is Professor Tim Entwisle. Tim is Director and Chief Executive of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Melbourne, where he's been for a couple of years. It'll be good. Before that, he was at Kew, and before that, 8 years as Chief Executive at the Sydney Botanic Gardens. But Tim, despite the executive load, also does science, and he's an expert in freshwater algae. And whereas any of us here would be mightily pleased to have a species named after us, Tim has got a genus and a family and an order named after him. So he must have done something good. But Tim's the sort of scientist we need more of. He's a committed science communicator. He blogs, tweets, talks on the radio and writes books and takes every chance to promote science, plants and gardens. Tim's subject today is Tim Entwisle is a Murderer, the telling tale of 10 trees 10 years ago. Please welcome Tim Entwisle.
Thank you, John. And I didn't get the genus named after me because of this, I should rush to say. But what I thought it's a safe distance to talk about this topic now. It's actually 11 years, but that didn't sound so good, so I'm pretending it's 10. And it's a time when I was in Sydney, and I thought it's also a very safe distance from Sydney to talk about it as well. I know there's a couple of Sydney people here, and Stuart will remember a lot of the detail of this, but it's also interesting in the context of today where we are talking quite rightfully about conserving and looking after our trees, but there's the flip side of that and what happens when we do have to take them out. And I was sort of watching each talk with trepidation, sort of looking at protesters and people lobbying and all that kind of thing and thinking, I'm sort of on the other side here. But nevertheless, here you go. This is the telling tale of 10 trees 11 years ago. And I just in case you don't pick up things today, I slipped this in this morning. I wrote an opinion piece for today's Australian on this very topic, giving you a bit of the gory details of it as well. So if you don't, and they've got a terrible paywall on the web, so you've got to buy the paper or something crazy like that. But there's a little bit more background to it. And the title there is interesting, Killing a Tree Makes Room for New Life. And that's provocative, of course. But in a way, this is the big question, I suppose. You are killing a tree. And we were looking for ways of, you always talk about removing trees, taking them out and replacing them, all that kind of thing. But you are killing a tree at some point in its life. And the trees I was killing, I'll be try and be upfront about this, were Moreton Bay figs. And these were figs that were planted by Charles Moore, who was the director of Sydney's gardens for 48 years, an incredibly long time. And did shape a lot of what was going on in Sydney, in the Botanic Gardens, and all around New South Wales, a bit like Guilfoyle and Mueller did here in Victoria. And he had a fondness for Moreton Bay figs, Ficus macrophylla, subspecies macrophylla, which grows up further north of Sydney. It's not native to Sydney, but a beautiful tree, and of course grows wonderfully in many, many places around Australia, and beautifully in Melbourne too. And there's just a couple of quotes there. It wasn't all that popular at the time. Moore loved them, but his predilection for that scourge of the gardens of Moreton Bay fig and the Moreton Bay fig epidemic were some of the quotes that were around a little bit after his time. So not everyone was pleased with him planting Moreton Bay figs everywhere. Now, we in the domain at Sydney's gardens and in the gardens itself, we have a lot of Moreton Bay figs. And in the 2000s, we had to take out 10 of these trees, or we had to take out 11 trees, some of which were Moreton Bay figs. So what we did is we went through the process you do as a responsible organisation, or we felt. You put up signs, you explain what you're doing. You don't necessarily have to take in all the detail there, but we explained there are old trees there. Like people, we said trees are mortal and have a finite time on this earth. We tried to point out gently to people that trees did have a time when they had to come out. And we wanted to replant them to renew a landscape that was there previously. We didn't just want to patch it up over time, and that was an important point as well. And that meant we had to take out some trees, 13 in total at the start, and then we reduced that down to 11, and we were going to plant 33 replacements. And just down the very bottom left, for those you can see, There's about 3,000 big trees in Sydney's Botanic Gardens and Domain. There's 400 figs in there, ficus species, and about 140 Moreton Bay figs. So we were taking some away because this became important later on, because when you get news reports that say that the figs in the Domain are being removed, I'd go onto radio and they'd say, so there won't be any figs left in the whole Domain. I said, there'll be one or two, don't worry. We were taking a small number of figs out. So the details become important. So we did lots of planning. We had workshops. You'll notice the word Sydney City Council appears a few times here because they are important in this particular event, and they came to these workshops. I just need to point that out now. The reports on trees recommended some be removed, and these were reported in newspapers. We made sure we put out press releases. We sent letters to our neighbours. So the hospitals, the government, the state government is a neighbour in Sydney, so they're a very important stakeholder, and to the council, saying this tree replacement would start in 2004 in autumn, and we offered to brief them. We put the signs up, stuff on our website, and then we put out media release at the start of the year and tried to encourage articles in the local newspapers about what we're doing. Now, I rush to say I'm not necessarily at this stage saying is this a good or bad thing. I'm just explaining what we did. This is one of the signs we had out in the gardens. This is in front of the art gallery. It's a beautiful part of the Domain there, which we've just blocked the view with this big sign. But putting that to one side, we explain what the new avenue would look like too. So we're taking out trees, we're putting in some new trees, and we weren't going to have exactly the same avenue either. It wasn't going to be a Moreton Bay fig avenue, partly because they're not doing so well in the Domain. There's still an attack, and the Moreton Bay fig itself was not being recommended, certainly by our specialists in replanting. Some other figs were, but not the Moreton Bay fig. So we put out this diagram which showed the detail of the trees to go, the details that would be put in their place, and we set about to get that going. Now these are the trees we're taking out, and it's interesting to look at a public reaction to trees. We're taking out a camphor laurel and an African olive, which nobody cared about at all. They were all up cheering about that. Of course, they're noxious weeds. Nobody likes them. That said, camphor laurels can look pretty good in the right place. Plane tree, pretty boring. No one really cares about plane trees. Some people hate them. Some people don't like them. But mostly no one was particularly concerned. There was a tallowood and a swamp mahogany. This is a pair of flares. They were 70s plantings. And they really weren't really in the right place. They didn't look very attractive. And there was actually quite strong support for those once people realised, oh, they're gum trees, they're eucalypts. Now they must be important. So that was sort of the response that went through. We had one Port Jackson fig, which is a local species. The one species actually local to that area that would have grown naturally before those gardens were there, and 5 Moreton Bay figs, which grow further up north, beautiful trees in Sydney. Now we did what you do, and you've just heard Stuart talking about safety and sort of risk, and we do get obsessed with that. So we do what we call a safe, useful life expectancy. We categorise the trees. The ones we were taking out fell into these two categories of either a short, useful life, so 5 or to 15 more years, or we should remove them now within the next 5 years. And the tallowood was just a crazy planting in the wrong place, I will say. So it didn't fall into either of those categories. And there's that question, and this was alluded to too this morning already, about avenues of trees. And I've got a quote here from Greg Moore from a report he did for the Hyde Park. I was saying to Greg before, I don't think he even knew this was out there on the web, so he does now. You can't get an avenue of even-aged trees by tree replacement through attrition or individual trees or implanting, and you'll get something of different character and different ambience. Now he wasn't saying there's a lot of ifs and buts that, and it's very well expressed in the report. But the point is, if you wanted to get an even-aged avenue, you need to do some bulk replacement. And whether this is acceptable is not an arboricultural matter. It's all about heritage history, expectations, and it's interesting, it puts at the end the political reality of what can be achieved. This is a report just written in 2013, so well after this replacement. One of the other things that interests me at the time is a lot of people thought about the trees in the Domain as old growth forest almost. And there was this view put to me, we should let every tree die a natural death and we should let it decay into the ground. And we have trees, or we had trees in Sydney Gardens. We had the children's fig, which had a beautiful fence around it, wonderful, huge big Moreton Bay fig, and it would be kept almost to its death. We'd even prop branches, which we don't like doing. we'd allow that to stay there all that time. But you can't do, this is a park, not an old growth forest. So a tree planted for amenity, or whatever word you want to use, or for someone to love and cherish, is there as part of that park. It's not there as part of a natural system. So I had to make that point. Not, you know, it was a different kind of environment. It's a bit more like, this is Starhead in the UK. It's a created, artificial, man-made park with trees in it for a certain look that had a certain feel about them. And putting aside our love of trees, it's actually quite legitimate to sort of plant those, replant those, move those around if you're trying to create a look. That was the whole idea of the park. And, oh, sorry, so there's a picture missing there. Must be the translation. That's a beautiful picture of Victoria Park in Sydney, near the university. What it did show is that there was an old fig tree and a little fig tree. And I think, Stuart, you made this point. You can't always grow trees, new trees, next to old trees. So if we are going to replace an avenue, one solution might be you start to interplant ones in between. Now, the problem is you don't get even age. The other problem is those little ones don't grow very well. With figs particularly, there's a pretty awful example here in Victoria Park that you can't see that shows that those young trees just don't grow next to old trees. So you can't do that. And you can't always set up another avenue next door either. You sort of take over the park if you do that. One of the other questions that came up is we were suggesting replanting with different trees, and we had good sort of horticultural reasons for that, and we thought a different palette of trees from the original palette grown in the domain. So we took history into account, but we weren't planting exactly the same. But there was an oak avenue. So if you went back before the Moreton Bay figs, there was an oak avenue along Hospital Road. So what should we recreate? If you were going to recreate, would you replant oaks, for example? Well, of course you can. Or you could put Moreton Bay figs, or you can come up with a design that's even better. It's one thing you have to keep in mind, that history is a fantastic thing, but history is not always the best thing. It's not always the ultimate thing, and you need to reinterpret that when you replant. So the first reactions to it, we put this out publicly, and we got lots. Figs are great for headlines too. They can come up with very sort of funny lines about them. But so domain awaits its root and branch removal. Axe falls on but one tree, that's the truth. This was a reference to one of the trees being called the truth tree. And the truth tree was, somewhat ironically perhaps, where the politicians used to stand to give their interviews. And it was called the truth tree. We didn't actually know it was called the truth tree until we decided it didn't need to be there. And then we discovered it was called the truth tree. But we ended up keeping that for a variety of reasons. And that was interesting because it was for its individual, historic and cultural importance. And we did legitimately think after researching it, that tree was worth sort of fencing. It was away from the road a bit and we could look after it, cutting it back, making it look ugly, which we had to do, but because it had that story and that link, that was okay. You know, we were happy to learn about things. So no reprieve for the figs, they're doomed to death. Now the other problem at the time was that we had a new Lord Mayor come in. Now Clover Moore came in just a few days before we announced this as Lord Mayor of Sydney. And Stuart, she's still there, is she? Oh, yes. Yeah, oh good, okay, well, and what happened was that she had a strong interest in the natural environment, which is very positive for Sydney. And actually, I should point out at the start that a lot of the influence she's had in Sydney has been very, very positive for trees and the environment. But she heard about this tree removal and decided, as you can when you're a politician, that it's a bad thing, that this shouldn't be happening, you should not remove a tree. And we all fall for this a little bit. Well, not fall for it. We all think a tree's a good thing, we have to keep it. And that's our initial reaction, that's my initial reaction. We're a bunch of tree huggers at Botanic Gardens. So that led to what I've called there a tsunami, which meant we had people protesting in the gardens. We had the Lord Mayor saying that I should be sacked. I'd only been in the job for a month. It was a bit of a rough introduction. I was getting ready to go and meet her and say hello and how lovely it was to work with her. And I was being asked to be sacked. And we had people in trees, and there was a temporary reprieve when protesters got into trees and we stopped work. So we'd taken out 5 of the trees, and we did have people change of the trees effectively. And although it's a very Sydney CBD thing where cappuccinos and pizzas were being passed up to those that were sitting up in the trees. So very luxurious protesting. And there were people out there who are, look, lovely people who are friends of mine and became friends again after a sort of period of maybe 4 or 5 years. Yeah. But you get, you know, wake up Sydney, save the trees, this looks like it's dead and dangerous. Okay, so these are the expert opinions. Is that tree dead or dangerous? So the dilemma and the hard thing in communicating this is you do get expert opinion and you do have to take notice of that. And it's very hard when we're in a community to make those calls. And so by any means, so we had headlines like Clover, my dead body, but Clover Moore would not allow it to happen. And the council passed a motion to include us in a tree preservation order. And Stuart mentioned that. And we had, because we're Botanic Gardens and we know everything, that's sort of, we often give that impression, but because we're Botanic Gardens, we do have experts on trees. We have responsibility for looking after those trees under our care. But the council thought that they should have responsibility because they represented the community. Now that's a kind of legitimate thought, except that Botanic Gardens are not just for the Sydney CBD community. That's a very, very interesting point to think through about what Botanic Gardens are actually for. But nevertheless, we also have a little bit of expertise. And so we were stymied to get rid of these doomed fig trees. They didn't have the, because it turned out though, they didn't have the authority to put a tree preservation order on our land. So it turned out they would like to, but they couldn't. So what do you do when you like to do something and you can't? You take someone to court. So the City Council took us to the Land and Environment Court, which you've heard mentioned already as well. And she was going to end the chainsaw massacre that was going to go on in the domain. So from this lovely replacement of an avenue, it became a chainsaw massacre as it developed. And we'd already taken out some of the trees. I mentioned them before, so the easy ones are gone, if you like. The tallow wood, which was a tree that was pretty awful in the setting, was still there, and the 5 Moreton Bay figs were still in place. And along the way, there were a couple of asides that were a little bit light relief, I guess. And one is Sir Mark Hartley, and there was a bit of a story about fig expert uses bogus credentials, and the report was his knighthood came from the Hutt River Province in Western Australia. But more importantly, it's a cheap shot, I guess. But the bottom thing, he made the quote that no branches have fallen on me, it must have been since I've been standing here. So he stood under one of the trees doing a media scrum, and said, there are no trees that have fallen on me all the time I've been standing here, therefore this tree is safe. So that's the kind of, and although his quote there, trees are not given to us by our parents, entrusted to us by our children, is an interesting one, because what I felt I was doing was actually leaving something for my children. So it depends how you look at that in perspective. And there were various other facts and fantasies, and again, this whole thing about not a single person being injured by a limb in the last 180 years was a rather brave statement to make. And it turned out somebody had quite recently, but also the branches fall off these trees. And you don't have to, if you jump down to the bottom here, there have been 29 incidents in the last sort of 4 years with trees of the age we were taking out dropping limbs. 1 in 5 lost a major limb, over 10 centimetres and up to 1,000 kilograms. We had a Moreton Bay fig in the Botanic Gardens one day near the Opera House that dropped a limb. A huge, if you look at some of those trees, the size of those limbs, they drop them in summer, often on still days, this classic summer drop. And I said to somebody, it happened early in the morning, I said, did anyone get hurt? And they sort of looked at me and said, got no idea. This branch is so big we couldn't see if anyone was underneath it. I should say no one was hurt. We did remove the limb and no one was hurt. But that's the kind. It is a really kind of. They can be dangerous trees, but you know we manage them and we don't panic about that. But occasionally we have to look after them. Another thing that happened, I talk about this in the Australian article today about. Kerry Packer dumped some mulch here because we'd exposed the roots when we were getting ready to take them out, and that was reported as us trying to kill the trees by exposing the roots. If you believe me, because I had to give the other side, that was we actually, once we'd exposed them and there'd been a bit of damage, we were allowing them to air dry so they wouldn't rot. So even if they did stay, it was a little bit better to leave them unexposed for a little while. Nevertheless, we got the mulch dropped on us. I rang Kerry Packer and I did have a conversation, which was interesting. And I got some advice about Moreton Bay figs. As I said, I said in this article in the Australian today that he did, just to be fair to him, he said at the end of his call, the advice I've given you is worth the price you paid for it. So his horticultural advice, yes, he didn't necessarily think I should take. We had a gypsy that was outraged and put a curse on Minister Davis, who was our Environment Minister at the time. And you do have to take things on the chin. You do, you know, these are the quotes: the trust is dishonest, can't be trusted, brain dead people to trust, the arrogance only equalled by ignorance. I was described as a fat, lazy bureaucrat, which I'm very offended by the bureaucrat part of that. And eventually this poor coot got handed a poison pellet. So they finally had some sympathy for me, thought, I must be someone else's problem, that handed it to me. And so that's a kind of generous, I suppose, allowance to get out. And there were art displays, and the Lord Mayor very kindly opened this victimisation of the Moreton Bay fig, destruction of domains, great treescapes, destruction of trees, sanctity, integrity, you get those kind of words. 15,000 signatures. This is a really hard thing to manage. And again, I'm not asking you to kind of judge whether it's the right decision or wrong decision, but how you get your message across. How do you explain to people what's going on when you do genuinely believe you're doing the right thing? You're not sort of doing it to irritate people or to get rid of a lovely old tree. There were a few voices of reason. This one from Jonathan Garner, who's president of the AGHS at the time. And this was nice to get a few of these. Proud and secure that gentlemen, that was the nice bit, not a bureaucrat, gentlemen, such yourselves are prepared to rebel against philosophy of avoiding issues and leaving it to another generation, true gardeners planning for future generations. That was nice, because I did feel we could have not made that decision, and it's easy not to, in fact, because the next director would have done it, or the one after that, or there might have been someone die from a tree death, there might not, it might have all been fine. To actually make the decision is a bit harder than not doing it. And our Minister Bob Davis said the hysteria today will be matched in 20 years by the elegance of a wonderful boulevard. Now he's a politician, he has to say it that way. We're now about 11 years on, as I said. So anyway, just the court case. I won't take you through the horror of the court case, but we went through all that. And there were 7 points that the council thought we had not done particularly well. But the result of that was that the tree preservation was no longer in effect, not only for us, as it turned out, but for the whole of Sydney. So for about 24 hours, you could have taken any tree out. It's too late now. Any tree out in the whole of Sydney, because there was Sydney CBD. The removal of 11 trees where there are 3,000 isn't an activity that comes under the Act. That was one of the points. We were properly performing under our powers and duties. We took into consideration historical significance, as we would. Not persuaded that the public or council were entitled to procedural fairness. That's interesting. They actually said, you're the experts. In a sense, you can do that. You don't need to tell the public. You can just go and do that because you know what you're doing. But in any event, we gave notice and we called for views. They actually saw all the stuff we did and said, look, you didn't have to do that, but in a legal sense, you did that really well. We didn't contravene the Heritage Act, which was another thing the council thought we might have done. And finally, was not manifestly unreasonable. Now, this comes back, it might have been, one of the speakers was saying, it is all about process. It's not really about this. All these decisions weren't about whether it was right or wrong, but did we follow the right process and do it in the correct way? And we did. And I loved the discussions we had in there about our replanting. In effect, we can replant something else if we think that's better. And we've gone through a really thoughtful process to do that. There's no one point to go back to in history. And that really irritated me, that there was this kind of historical overlay that said one time in history and that one species is the only thing you can put there. So that was something that was good to have confirmed. So eventually the city does give a fig at a cost, which was $200,000. So it held the whole thing up. It would have cost us months and months and hundreds of staff hours to actually deal with all this, of course. We're putting that to one side. There's a huge financial cost. There was a last hurrah, like all these things. There was a fig will be spared the chop by the Telegraph. The replacement plan reviewed in light of court evidence. In the court, the judge asked me this. He said, now, you've heard lots of evidence come here. Do you think you will change your mind on what you've done? And I said, no, I'm quite convinced in the decision. But what I do want to do is look at everything that came in and decide whether we've made the right choice on every single tree. There's been some great expert evidence here. Let me run through the plan again. So and we're a scientific organisation, we're an evidence-based organisation. So having done that, of course, I got slammed for making a mistake and just re-deciding because I did decide one tree could stay, and I was quite happy that, to tell you the truth, it still should have come out on aesthetic grounds and landscape grounds, but I was willing to say, okay, this has got another 10, 15 years in, there was enough value, enough of the other criteria there to keep it. So anyway, we admitted its report on tree health was wrong. Well, what we actually did was listen to what came out in the court case, and we changed one tree. So you can't really win. Then the Lord Mayor said she wasn't adequately consulted after the court case. So anyway, Clover Moore and I still don't communicate all that well. Moore gives up domain, trees fight, figs face the chop, and a new order eventually that was signed that the trust was excluded from all their tree preservation orders. That happened in a fascinating meeting, which I can't give you details of, but between two government ministers, Clover Moore and myself, and as soon as Clover left, they signed the document and said, you know, it's done. The council can no longer have any control over the gardens after what she's done. We took the trees down. These are the figs that were being removed. We had a tree planting, and this is how. And we had children there. Now that's of course we were trying to make that a positive event, so you understand what we're doing. But new trees to replace those finite figs. There was one. This was what it said in the story: one minister, 2 trees, 16 school children, but no Lord Mayor. At yesterday's tree planting in Sydney's Royal Botanic Gardens. And another quote here from Greg. I'm giving you a lot of coverage here. This from the same report. And I thought this was very nice. We've inherited the benefit from the legacy of bold decisions. Again, harping back that comment I had before, and boulevards by a generation who would never see the landscapes they planned and planted in maturity, but did it with future generations in mind. It's time for us to look at the future, make bold decisions. That doesn't mean we take out old trees. That doesn't mean we don't look after every single tree we can. It just means we have to think about the next step and the next stage, and not be a little bit I was surprised by people's selfishness. I did have somebody say to me, they didn't care about the next generation, they wanted that tree to be there for themselves. Now, I sort of get that, but I wasn't particularly pleased to hear that from the community. This was just 2 years later. These are that we put in Araucarias, there's Washington palms, and there was a white fig put into place, the Moreton Bay fig. And these are some of the plantings here. There's one of the old Moreton Bays there. And I think I've got another one. This is 2013. These are the new white figs here. People are now picnicking under those. And I made one of those great comments. You know, I said in 10 years' time, you'll be picnicking under one of my new trees. And they're not in this picture, but I have got some pictures of people actually picnicking under the trees 11 years later. Oh, very interesting. I can't remember what was on that, but anyway, and just taking us to where we're going now. So that with that, having gone through that process and having, I suppose, that lesson, what's interesting to me is to think about, have things changed or are they different? I think things are. I like to think that wouldn't have happened in Melbourne. That's one comment. Just a slight, as someone not living in Sydney anymore, a sophistication in the way we approach our trees. And we've heard about problems today, but we can be very mature about it. And we've heard about the Borough Charter, and there are various documents around where we are thinking more about our trees and thinking through some of those issues. And I think that's a very good thing to actually try and articulate our decisions and explain what we're doing. And there are some great guidelines around, and there's a lot more thinking about what an avenue is and a replacement, and just, you know, questioning those comments that came up during my time at Sydney, which was, you know, you should replace them one at a time. Why are you doing this? So there's a lot more explanatory material around. This is from South Australia. And even this, which you'd know from the recent Australian Garden History magazine, whether or not you agree with this quote, I just think, again, it's interesting to think about things. And this is Tim Richardson saying, in restoration, we need to be careful about the claims we make for it and when to leave well alone, and throwing out that kind of, you know, slightly radical suggestion that we're inviting an equally talented designer to replace something that's been designed by a talented designer. So you don't necessarily keep the old design. What I like about this, I suppose, is only that we're thinking. We're having intellectual conversations and thinking about it, and not just lavishly following a black and white response to our tree replacement. And the lessons I thought I learnt from all that, charters and guidelines help explain but not decide. In the end, it's very, very hard to put that decision, to articulate that. And I don't think we're ever going to be able make that in a... We can have guidelines and thoughts and, you know, conversations, but it's very hard to articulate. Devise and articulate clear landscape. So you need to explain the decision you made. That's the important thing. So whatever basis you make it, you then explain it. Use expert rather than community decision making. That probably sounds a bit abrupt and saying, I don't want the community involved. It's not that. It's just that you don't vote on these things. You don't vote on whether a tree stays. If 90% of the community wants it to stay, you damn well sort of think there's something wrong and you probably should keep it. But you then still have to bring in expert evidence for your opinions, I believe. Consult and notify the community as often as possible. I don't think we did it quite enough at the start, to be fair, looking back on it. Seek champions for the cause and document everything just in case. So if you do end up in court, this is the thing that's the most important out of all those. And my final one, I'll leave you with that. These things do, you know, they sort of fade away, and I was thinking, you know, they all die. But this is on a Facebook page, 2013, in response to the ring barking of the separation tree, and it's somebody, anyway, having a... it's interesting they spell my name the same way as on that sign on the tree, but anyway. It's saying, you know, these trees were diseased, culturally significant, decades of life left. So people don't forget, and you'll never convince everybody. And I think that's something I've learned, that there are, you know, there'll still be people in Sydney who are perhaps unsure about why that decision was made. Thank you.